Welcome to First Issues. Tonight, our topic of discussion will be on money and relationships. Yes, romantic relationships. However, our focus will be on those relationships where the couple is not married. We all have hopes, aspirations, and dreams that we wish to achieve in our lives. Some of us want to invest in property, buy a car, or just simply move out from home to start living independently from our parents. Sometimes these hopes and aspirations seem impossible because of a lack of money to get started. However, did you know that if you and your partner pool your financial resources, all of these would be possible? Yes, we understand that it is easier said than done because where does one even begin? It is just for that purpose that we've invited to the program chartered financial analyst Malik Shehu. Malik shares some of the ways in which you and your partner can maximize your incomes towards bettering your lives outside of wedlock.
One way in which you can maximize your income is to say, okay, what are the expenses of our household? Assuming you're cohabiting, right? What are the expenses of our household? If you're looking at your rent, electricity, water, utilities, all of that, you decide, okay, no, this is how much it comes to. Now you can say, okay, since Malcolm earns the majority of the income, you can put Malcolm's earnings towards taking care of the household. Now the taking care of the household could be all the expenses plus the entertainment. So what happens to Mary's income? It goes towards building or growing the assets of that relationship. It could go into savings, it could be emergency savings, it could go into investments, or it could go into reducing their debt, okay? The second way to do it is to look at the proportion of their income. If Malcolm earns 5, Marie earns 3, the total is 8, all right? Now that means that Malcolm would spend 5/8 of his income on the expenses, and Marie would spend 3/8. But again, these are expenditures. You still have to grow the relationship by growing the wealth. All right. So in as much as you've taken care of the expenses and the expenditures, you also have to look at saving for the future or investing for the future. Again, you have to calculate how much each Malcolm and Marie want to set aside, and they would set aside proportionate to their income. And then lastly is where now you look for certain goals that you're trying to achieve and you save for them specifically. So you can look at it as mental accounting. So you can decide, okay, if we want to have our first car in 2 years from now, you can start a car fund. Another thing is weddings. Weddings are not cheap. They're very expensive. You still have to look at the lobola, you still have to look at the wedding proceedings, and so on and so forth. You can decide, let's start a wedding fund. You can say, okay, let us put in maybe 2,000 each into the wedding fund. All right? That's 4,000 per month. That's times 12, that's 48,000 a year. All right, and you can do that multiplied by 3. By the time 3 years has passed, you would have had enough money to take care of the lobola and whatever wedding proceedings that you might need. And you can also have other things as well. You know, if you both had a kid, or if you have a kid outside wedlock, you also have to look at things like education planning. So with that, you can set aside money for their education.
But Malik, how practical is this from a financial advisor's point of view? What do people in these or hoping to go into the sort of setup need to know and understand about what it is they're about to do?
People change, first and foremost. You know, 1 minute you are happily in love and the next minute you may not be happily in love, all right? So it's very important to understand your partner. That's number 1. Number 2, communication is very, very important, all right? Sitting down and agreeing and saying, okay, this is what I want to do, or rather this is what I'd like us to do, helps diffuse any confusion, first and foremost. And then secondly, it's always important you can put it in writing to say, okay, in as much as we are in a relationship, we understand that if anything changes, we may break up, all right? Put it into writing. You can even get a lawyer and decide to say, okay, this is what we agree. Think of it as a relationship contract, okay? Because imagine a situation where Malcolm and Marie have been saving for the past 3 years. And then one day, one of them wakes up and decides, I can't do this anymore. I want out. And now they have both saved a huge amount of money. The question now becomes, how do they split it? Right? Who gets that money?
But from your experience, which one is better? To share finances within the institution of marriage, or just to share finances in the understanding that we're together long term, we want a lifetime partnership, even if it does not work out?
I think it's usually better when you're married because you're protected by certain laws, right? And it, like I said, it can also work when you're unmarried. However, it's important to have a conversation and you can have written agreement. So it can work both ways at the end of the day. Because in marriage, what protects you is the law, right? Depending on if it's you have signed a prenup or anything of that sort. But out of wedlock, if you don't sign anything, you're not protected. So signing something, having an agreement also protects you outside of marriage like you are within a marriage.
It does happen on occasion that people go their separate ways, unfortunately. In that case, what happens to all the assets that were jointly obtained during happier times? Our conversation on money and relationships continues with Bonolo Selelo, who's a lawyer. Her first establishment during this discussion is what needs to be in place before pulling resources to attain anything jointly outside of wedlock.
When you look at the law, there really doesn't have to be anything in place except for the relationship. And as you said, if people are in a relationship for a long time, there's almost an automatic creation of joint ownership of property through something called a universal partnership. So sometimes the circumstance can lead to the creation of such a relationship without the parties actively saying we are getting this joint property together.
You mean to tell me there's nothing that requires me to have some sort of documentation, say a promissory note or a binding contract or some sort of thing that will protect me later if things were to go down south?
Well, the thing is, that's where the universal partnership aspect comes in. Because even though universal partnership by definition of law is a commercial thing, it can also be used by people that are in romantic relationships. Effectively, one of the parties, usually the one with a lesser estate, will say, I contributed to the growth of the estate of the other person. And they can then demonstrate how they contributed. It can be in the form of labor, where they've worked at this person's business, or the person was building and they went to the construction site to supervise and things like that. And it can be in the form of money, where a partner will give someone money and say, yes, let's do this project together. So it can happen automatically in that sense, where you're just living your lives and going about it that way. But then it can also be conscious, where you say, I'm giving you this, we're buying this together.
Okay, let us then talk about the conscious aspect of it, right? Does it then mean that I can have, say I give my partner money to go buy 1, 2, 3. Can I have a binding contract that I can sign and they can sign so that later, if something were to happen, then I can say, but I contributed 1, 2, 3 towards 6, 7, 8.
There could be a creation of a contract between the parties depending on what it is that the other person wants out of it. So when we're talking about the money thing, the example that you've given, if I give my partner, let's say 100 pula to go and buy a pot plant, with the understanding that when this pot plant comes, then we both own it, then we are creating some sort of contract in that when the pot plant comes and we've broken up, then I can say, okay, pay me half because I own part of this pot plant. So the same can be true for immovable property, for example, where I take a loan, but we want to buy this property in your name if we're in a relationship. And because I'm the one financing, there would be a mortgage bond passed called a surety mortgage bond, right? Mm-hmm. Because it would be in your name. But also we can have the property registered in both our names so that whoever looks at it can see that Bonolo and Bonatero own this property together.
You know, I think you've just alluded to my next question, but I want you to elaborate further on what happens to those assets that we've jointly attained together once we now decide this is not working for us, let us go our separate ways.
So where there's a conscious effort to share assets and money and so on, it's usually easier. Where it becomes problematic is where it wasn't conscious. People had this relationship and it led to this joining of their estates. And therefore, that's when they have to go to court and say, I'm entitled to these and these and these things because this is how I contributed to the growth of this other person's asset.
So when making this lodging at the court, is it done in the same way that a divorce is done?
No, it's not similar to the divorce in that what you're asking for from the court is not to separate you. What you're asking for is a division of the property that you have acquired together. So in this particular instance of a universal partnership, usually the court won't look at the assets you had before the relationship. They will just look at the growth of the assets that you have had during the relationship.
This program was brought to you in association with First National Bank of Botswana.
FNB, how can we help you?